My ex-husband thought he could secretly move our daughter to another state, and I would never find out. But he didn't realize she had been calling me every night. The school secretary's voice was carefully neutral in the way that voices get when the person speaking them has been trained to deliver bad news, without inflection, without opinion, without the tremor that would confirm what you're already feeling in the base of your throat. She said, "Mrs. Aldridge, I'm calling because Lily wasn't at school today, and we have a note in her file that she has a perfect attendance record, so we wanted to check in." I had dropped Lily off at her father's house on Sunday evening. It was his week. That was the custody arrangement, week on, week off, alternating. Signed and sealed in family court 2 years ago, when Garrett and I finalized our divorce after 11 years of marriage, and one daughter who deserved better than either of us was managing to give her in those last brutal months before we admitted the marriage was done. I knew Lily was supposed to be at school because I knew Lily's schedule better than I knew my own heartbeat. She had perfect attendance. She had it because she cared about it, because at 9 years old she had decided that school was a place she loved, and attendance was a thing she could control, and she worked at it with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything she cared about. And she had not been there that morning. I thanked the secretary. I said there must have been a miscommunication. I said I'd look into it. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor of my apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, with my phone in both hands, and called Garrett. He didn't answer. I called 3 more times in the next 4 minutes. He didn't answer any of them. I sent a text that said, "Lily wasn't at school. Call me immediately." I sent a second one that said, "What, Garrett, now?" Neither showed as read. I sat on the kitchen floor for another 2 minutes, which is a very long time when your body has fully committed to the biological response to threat, the cold hands, the shallow breathing, the hyper-awareness that makes the hum of the refrigerator sound like a signal you should be decoding. Then I got up, got my keys, and drove to Garrett's house on the other side of Asheville, which took 18 minutes in traffic that felt like an insult. I'd been living in this city for 6 years, longer than Garrett had, longer than our marriage had actually functioned, and I knew every route and every shortcut, and I took all of them, and it still took 18 minutes. When I turned onto his street, I could see from a block away that his car wasn't in the driveway. When I parked and walked to the front door, I could see through the sidelight window that the entryway was empty in a specific way. Not the ordinary emptiness of a house where people have gone out for the day, but the stripped, echoing emptiness of a house where things have been removed. I tried the doorbell. I tried knocking. I cupped my hands against the window and looked inside and saw a living room with rectangular marks on the carpet where furniture had stood and a wall with pale squares where pictures had hung. Gone. Just like that, my daughter was gone. I had been Lily's primary parent for most of her life, which is not a political statement or an indictment of Garrett specifically, just an accurate description of how our household had organized itself over a decade. I was a pediatric occupational therapist with a practice I'd built from the ground up, and my schedule, while demanding, had the particular flexibility of someone who owns her own business and can arrange her calendar around a child's school events and sick days and the 1,000 small logistical emergencies that constitute raising a human person. Garrett worked in regional sales for a medical device company, which meant he traveled frequently, unpredictably, and often on short notice. During our marriage, this had been a source of ongoing friction, not because he didn't want to be present, but because his physical presence was structurally unreliable in ways that mine wasn't. He was, in his way, a good father. He loved Lily visibly and specifically, knew her favorite books and her fears and what kind of cereal she would and wouldn't eat, but the day-to-day mechanics of her life, the school pickups and doctor appointments and homework battles and the bedtime routines that required exactly the same sequence of events every single night or she couldn't sleep, those had always been primarily mine. The divorce hadn't changed that substantially. The custody agreement gave us equal time, but my phone was the one the school called. My name was listed first on emergency contacts, and Lily, when she was upset or sick or confused, called me. Or this was not a secret. Garrett knew it. Our mediator had gently noted it in the documentation. It was simply true. Garrett and I had divorced without particular animosity, which I want to be honest about because it matters to what came later. We hadn't been happy for a long time. Probably the last 3 years of the marriage were more habit and co-parenting logistics than anything resembling a genuine partnership. But we'd managed the end of it without the kind of scorched earth warfare that I'd watched other couples deploy. We used a mediator instead of adversarial attorneys. We divided assets reasonably. We agreed on the custody arrangement without a court battle. We were, by the standards of divorce, almost civilized. I attributed this partly to us being reasonable adults and partly to the fact that neither of us wanted Lily to grow up watching her parents perform their grievances at each other's expense. She was 7 when we finalized everything. She had adjusted with the resilience that children show when their parents handle things well, which is to say she had her sad months and her confused questions and her occasional meltdowns at transitions. But she stabilized, and by the time she turned 9, she moved between our houses with something approaching ease. I thought we'd done it right. I thought that a lot, in the weeks after I stood outside Garrett's empty house with my hands pressed against the glass, trying to understand what I was looking at. The first person I called after standing at that window was my attorney, Denise Okafor. Denise had represented me in the divorce and had been in family law practice in Asheville for 14 years. She was methodical, unhurried, and had a specific quality that I'd come to appreciate deeply. She never let urgency make her sloppy. Even on the phone, pulled out of what I later learned was a client meeting, she asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen, in what order, and what I had and hadn't confirmed. I told her about the school call, the unanswered phone calls, the empty house. She told me 3 things in rapid succession. First, take photographs of the exterior of the house and through the windows right now. Second, call Garrett's employer to see if he had submitted a relocation request or taken a leave of absence. Third, call her office back within the hour. I did all 3. And the photographs were on my phone within 4 minutes. Garrett's employer, a company called Medcore Distribution with a regional office in Asheville, confirmed after some back and forth with an HR representative that Garrett Aldridge had resigned his position effective the previous Friday. 3 days ago. He had resigned 3 days ago and said nothing to me. Nothing to our daughter's school, nothing that would indicate he was moving anywhere. My hands were shaking when I called Denise back. Not from cold this time, from something more specific and more frightening than cold. Denise filed an emergency motion with the Buncombe County Family Court that same afternoon. The motion requested an emergency order requiring Garrett to immediately disclose Lily's location and return her to Asheville. Citing violation of the custody agreement's geographic restriction clause, which Denise explained to me with the careful precision of someone who knows they're talking to a person on the edge of panic, specifically prohibited either parent from relocating with Lily more than 50 miles from Asheville without written consent from the other parent and court approval. This clause was standard, she said. It was in virtually every custody agreement that involved a child of school age. Garrett had signed it. He knew it existed, which meant that whatever he had done it knowing exactly what he was violating. The emergency motion was assigned to Judge Carolyn Whitfield, who had been on the family court bench for 9 years and who, Denise told me, had a very low tolerance for unilateral relocation. Judge Whitfield scheduled an emergency hearing for the following morning at 8:30 a.m. and issued a temporary order requiring Garrett to contact the court within 24 hours with Lily's location. That order was served by the county sheriff's department to Garrett's last known address, the empty house on Meridian Street, and to his last known cell phone number via text and email. By 6 p.m. that evening, he had not responded to any of them. I went home and sat in my apartment and waited for Lily to call. She called every night. This was not a formal arrangement, not something we'd written down or agreed to in the custody documentation. It had simply emerged as a practice during Garrett's weeks, something Lily had initiated and that I'd never refused, and that Garrett had never objected to. Well, probably because refusing would have required him to explain to a 9-year-old why she couldn't call her mother before bed, and that explanation did not exist in any form that a reasonable person could deliver to a child. She called at 8:15 most nights, occasionally 8:30, sometimes as late as 9, if something had happened during the day that she needed to talk through. I had never missed one of her calls in the 2 years since the divorce. I sat on my couch with my phone on the cushion next to me and watched the time change and didn't let myself look away from it. 8 o'clock, 8:15, 8:30, 8:45, 9 o'clock, 9:15, 9:30. She didn't call. I called her. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Not ringing, not even giving me the satisfaction of ringing, just voicemail, which meant her phone was off or the number had been changed or the phone had been taken. I called Garrett again, voicemail. I texted him 8 times in 40 minutes, each one more direct than the last. None of them answered. At 10:15, I called Denise again and told her Lily hadn't called and her phone was going to voicemail. Denise said this would be part of the emergency hearing documentation in the morning. I said I understood. Then I went to bed and lay there with every light on until about 3 a.m. when I fell asleep for 3 hours from sheer exhaustion. The emergency hearing the next morning was brief and procedurally significant. Judge Whitfield noted Garrett's failure to respond to the court's order and found him in contempt, which carried a potential fine and the possibility of arrest. She also issued a bench warrant that would be executed if Garrett was located in North Carolina, amended the temporary order to require Lily's immediate return to Buncombe County, and authorized Denise to serve the expanded order to any known associates of Garrett's who might have information about his location. What she could not do, what the geographic limits of state family court jurisdiction prevented her from doing, was compel enforcement in another state without knowing which state he'd gone to. This was the wall we kept hitting in those first days. We didn't know where he was. We knew he'd left. We knew he'd planned it. We knew he'd taken our daughter, but without a location, the orders were pieces of paper with no address to deliver them to. I left the courthouse at 9:45 a.m. with a folder full of court documents and absolutely nowhere to bring them. The second institution I contacted was the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, whose hotline I found online and called from the courthouse parking lot while Denise was still inside gathering copies of the filings. The intake coordinator I spoke to was a woman named Portia Greaves, and I want to describe this conversation in some detail because it was the first moment in 48 hours when I felt like I was talking to someone who fully understood what was happening without requiring me to convince them of its seriousness. Portia had been with the organization for 7 years. She understood the specific horror of parental abduction, which is the technical term, not kidnapping in the stranger danger sense, but the removal of a child by one parent in violation of a custody order, which is a federal crime under the Parental Kidnapping Prevention Act when it crosses state lines. She walked me through what the organization could do, adding Lily to their database, coordinating with law enforcement, providing resources for families in my situation, and she told me one thing that I wrote down immediately and have since repeated to anyone going through something similar. The parent who takes a child across state lines in violation of a custody order almost always makes contact with someone they trust. That contact is usually how we find them. I asked her what I should do. She said to contact the FBI because federal involvement was what gave cases like mine actual cross-state reach. When she said to get a custody evaluator on record immediately in case the case went to relocation hearings. And she said to document every single thing, every call I'd made, every voicemail, every text, every piece of evidence that my daughter had been living a normal, stable life in Asheville up until the moment she disappeared. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my car for a few minutes, pressing the backs of my hands against my eyes. Then I drove home and started making a binder. The FBI field office in Asheville handled my case intake through Special Agent Darnell Pruitt, who had 12 years with the Bureau and 5 of those in the Crimes Against Children unit. He was professional and direct in a way that I found more reassuring than warmth would have been. Because what I needed in that moment was not comfort. I had my friend Tasha Okonkwo for that, my closest friend since graduate school, who had been at my apartment every evening since this started, cooking food I wasn't eating and sitting with me in the specific valuable silence of someone who know they can't fix what's wrong, but won't pretend the situation is other than what it is. What I needed from Special Agent Pruitt was competence and reach, and he provided both. He explained the federal framework clearly. Under the Fugitive Felon Act, unlawful flight to avoid prosecution could apply once a state felony warrant was issued, and the family court contempt charge combined with the violation of the custody order was moving toward that threshold. He could not yet classify Lily as a missing child in the NCMEC sense, because there was no evidence of abuse or danger beyond the violation itself, but he opened a federal parental abduction file and assigned an analyst to track Garrett's credit cards, phone records, and any other digital trail that would establish his location. He told me this would take some days. He told me to be patient. He said it in the tone of someone who knows that patience is the wrong word but doesn't have a better one. I want to talk about Lily's phone calls now because this is where the story turns and where I need to be precise about what happened and when. On the third night after Lily disappeared, a Wednesday, Lily having not called Sunday, Monday, or Wednesday nights, my phone rang at 8:22 p.m. from a number I didn't recognize, area code 615. It answered before it finished its first ring. It was Lily. Her voice was quiet and fast, the way her voice got when she was trying not to be overheard. She said, "Mom, I only have a minute. He took my phone, but I borrowed Mrs. Whitaker's." I asked her where she was. She said Nashville. She said, "Daddy said we're moving here. He said you knew." I told him you didn't know because you would have told me, and he said you did know, and you didn't tell me because you didn't want me to be upset. I held my breath and kept my voice level, and I told her I was going to come get her, that everything was going to be okay, that she needed to tell me her address if she knew it. She said she didn't know the exact address, but that they were at Claudette's apartment. I asked who Claudette was. She said Claudette was Daddy's girlfriend. That she'd met her a few times, that the apartment was near something called Centennial Park. Then I heard a voice in the background, not Garrett's, a woman's voice. And Lily said quickly, "I love you, Mom, I have to go." And the call ended. Nashville. Garrett had taken my daughter to Nashville, Tennessee, where his girlfriend lived. I had not known about a girlfriend. In 2 years of co-parenting with minimal personal conversation, he had never mentioned anyone named Claudette, had never introduced Lily to anyone, had not given any indication that his personal life had evolved to the point where moving in with a girlfriend was a viable option he was considering. This was also, I noted with a very cold and specific clarity, approximately 530 miles from Asheville. Not 50. Not the 50-mile radius specified in our custody agreement. 530 miles. In a different state with different courts and different law enforcement jurisdiction. And he had planned it. The resignation from his job, the cleared-out house, the canceled lease on his rental, all of it had been coordinated in advance. This wasn't impulsive. Garrett was not an impulsive person. He'd been planning this for weeks, possibly months, and he'd done it without a word to me, without a motion to modify the custody order, without anything that would have given me the opportunity to object, or the court the opportunity to weigh in. He'd simply decided that he wanted to be in Nashville with Claudette, and that Lily was coming with him, and that whatever legal machinery I was going to deploy against him was something he'd deal with later. Or perhaps something he genuinely believed I wouldn't pursue. I called Special Agent Pruitt's direct line at 8:27 p.m., 5 minutes after Lily's call ended. I told him Nashville, area code 615, near Centennial Park, girlfriend named Claudette. I told him about the borrowed phone, the quick call, the voice in the background that had ended it. He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear typing. Then he said, "Mrs. Aldridge, I need you to save that call in your phone records and not delete anything. I'm going to start the location process tonight." I asked what that meant. He said the area code and the proximity to a landmark combined with a known associate, Claudette, whoever she was, gave them a workable starting point. Cell carrier records, once subpoenaed, would confirm the call origin. A girlfriend with an apartment near Centennial Park was findable through any number of databases. He said to expect a development within 48 hours. I called Denise immediately after. She contacted the Tennessee court system first thing the following morning to begin the process of registering the North Carolina custody order in Davidson County, which is the county that contains Nashville and which would be the jurisdictional venue for any enforcement actions. This process, called registration of a foreign judgment, was what would give the Tennessee courts the authority to enforce what North Carolina had already ordered. It was not instant. It required filings and fees and the slow turning of institutional gears that feel intolerable when your 9-year-old is 600 miles away with a man who lied to her about why she was there. On the fourth night, Lily called again. Same unknown number. I later learned it was the cell phone of Claudette's neighbor, a woman named Audrey Whitaker, who was apparently unaware of the specific legal situation she was facilitating, but had taken pity on a child who'd asked to use her phone to call her mother. Lily sounded calmer this time, or maybe she'd had more time to prepare. She told me the apartment was on Elliston Place. She told me the building had a blue awning. She told me the apartment number was 12. She said this in the specific methodical way that children deploy when they've decided to be useful, listing facts like items on a grocery list. And I thought about what it meant that my 9-year-old had looked up an address and memorized it to give to me, that she had found a way to call when Garrett had taken her phone, that she had, in her small and determined way, been working to be findable. She said Daddy was saying she'd be starting at a new school on Monday. She said she didn't want a new school. She said she wanted to come home. I told her she was coming home. I said it as a fact, not a promise, because I needed her to hear it as certain. After we hung up, I sat with the address written on a Post-it note in front of me, Elliston Place, Blue Awning, Apartment 12, and felt something shift from fear into something colder and more purposeful. I had an address. Now I needed to use it correctly. Denise filed an emergency petition in Davidson County Family Court the following morning using the registered North Carolina order and Lily's confirmed address. The Tennessee family court system, once presented with a properly registered foreign judgment, was obligated under the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act, the UCCJEA, which governs exactly these cross-state custody situations, to enforce the originating state's order. The Davidson County Court signed the emergency petition to Judge Franklin Osei, a family court judge with 16 years on the bench who, Denise told me, had a firm and well-documented stance on parental abduction cases. His view, which was consistent with Tennessee's own statutes, was that unilateral relocation in violation of a custody order was not a gray area and should not be treated as one. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at 9 a.m. Denise flew to Nashville to appear in person. I drove. 8 hours. I left Asheville at 4 a.m. Sunday morning because I needed to be in Nashville the night before the hearing, and I needed to be in the car, moving, doing something physical and directional toward my daughter, rather than sitting in an apartment waiting for time to pass. I want to describe the drive because it was one of those experiences that exists outside of normal time. 8 hours is a long time to be alone with your thoughts when your thoughts are about your daughter sitting in an apartment you've never seen in a city she's never lived in. On being told by her father that this is her life now. I thought about Lily's first day of kindergarten and how she'd stood at the classroom door with her backpack that was almost as big as she was and looked back at me once, just once, and then walked in. I thought about the Wednesday nights she spent at my apartment during Garrett's weeks because sometimes the transition was hard and she'd call and say she just wanted to see me for a little while, and I'd go pick her up and we'd watch a movie on the couch and I'd drive her back in the morning. I thought about the fact that she had called me every single night during Garrett's custody weeks, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 40, sometimes just to tell me something that had happened at school or something funny she'd thought of, and that Garrett had known this and had not stopped it, and that somewhere in the gap between that knowledge and what he'd done with it was something I couldn't quite reconcile. He knew she called me. He knew she would find a way to call even without her phone, and he'd done it anyway. The drive took 8 hours and 13 minutes. I played the same 4 albums on repeat and didn't register any of the music. I arrived in Nashville at 12:22 p.m. on Sunday. I checked into a hotel near the courthouse. At 2 p.m., I walked to Elliston Place. I found the blue awning. I stood on the sidewalk across the street from Apartment 12's building and looked up at the windows and thought about going in, and then thought about Denise telling me very clearly that I was not to attempt to retrieve Lily myself, that doing so would compromise the legal proceedings and potentially expose me to a counter-allegation of interference, that the court appearance in the morning was the correct path and that I should trust it. I stood there for a while. Then I went back to my hotel and called Tasha, who had driven separately and arrived an hour after me. We sat in my hotel room and she made tea in the little in-room kettle, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with Garrett until I fell asleep at 9:30, which was the most sleep I'd had in a week. Lily called that night. Or rather, Faye Audrey Whitaker's phone called my phone at 8:18 p.m., and when I answered, Lily was there. She said, "Mom, are you close?" I told her I was in Nashville. There was a silence on her end, and then she said very quietly, "I knew you'd come." I told her to sleep well, that tomorrow was going to fix everything, that she didn't need to worry. She said she wasn't worried. She said that in the way kids say things that are a little bit bravado and a little bit genuine, and I thought about how she had spent a week finding borrowed phones and memorizing addresses and calling me every night despite every obstacle, and I thought that she probably, in fact, was not that worried, because she'd been working the problem herself all along. The Monday morning hearing before Judge Franklin Osei lasted 2.5 hours. Garrett appeared with the Tennessee attorney he'd apparently retained in the days since our filing, a man named Clifton Bray who had been in family law in Davidson County for 9 years, and who made the argument with professional composure that Garrett's relocation had been precipitated by changed circumstances, including a new employment opportunity in Nashville and a significant relationship that had developed there, and that the North Carolina custody order should be revisited in light of these changes rather than enforced punitively. Judge Osei listened to this argument for approximately 8 minutes before he said, with the measured precision of someone who has heard variations of this argument many times and found none of them persuasive, "Counselor, changed circumstances are addressed through a motion to modify custody. You filed with proper notice to all parties, reviewed by the relevant court, and decided with the child's best interests as the primary standard. They are not addressed by removing a child from her primary residential state, in violation of an existing order, and then requesting the courts of the destination state to ratify the decision after the fact. That is not how this works." He then ordered Lily's immediate return to Asheville, imposed a $4,500 contempt fine on Garrett, amended the Buncombe County order to grant me temporary sole physical custody pending a full review hearing, and referred the case to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges under Tennessee's custodial interference statute. He also noted, for the record, that the documentation provided by my attorney showed a pattern of deliberate concealment: the resigned job, the vacated residence, the child's phone being confiscated, the false statements to the child about maternal knowledge of the move, that went beyond a custody dispute into territory that would appropriately concern a criminal court. Garrett sat at the defense table through all of this with his jaw tight and his eyes on the table in front of him. Claudette was not present. I was in the gallery with Tasha and Denise and Special Agent Pruitt, who had driven from Asheville to be present as a federal witness if needed. When Judge Osei finished his ruling, there was a very brief silence in the courtroom, and then Denise leaned over to me and said quietly, "He has 4 hours to surrender Lily to your physical custody at the courthouse. So as per the order, if he doesn't, we call Pruitt and the federal warrant kicks in." He surrendered her in 2 hours and 40 minutes. I was waiting in a small room off the main courthouse hallway that a clerk had made available for exactly this kind of handoff when I heard footsteps in the corridor, and then the door opened and Lily walked in. She was wearing her school backpack, the one with the small embroidered patch of a cat that she'd put on herself last spring. She looked at me for exactly 1 second, and then she walked across the room and I put my arms around her, and that was it. That was the whole thing, right there in that moment. Everything else, the filings, the hearings, the 8-hour drive, the contempt orders and the federal file and the Davidson County DA's referral, all of it collapsed into a single specific point, which was my daughter walking into that room with her cat patch backpack and me putting my arms around her. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. We stood there for a while. Garrett stood in the doorway during the handoff, accompanied by Clifton Bray and a courthouse family services coordinator named Joelle Deschamps, who had 12 years of experience facilitating high-conflict custody transfers and who managed the handoff with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to keep these moments brief. Garrett said, "Lily, I love you." Lily said, "I know, Daddy." Her voice was even and careful in the way children's voices get when they are holding something back. Not because they don't feel it, but because this is not the time or the place, and they have correctly identified that the most useful thing they can do right now is get through the next few minutes without complicating them. I looked at Garrett once. He looked older than I remembered, which was probably only a week's worth of older, but felt like more. He looked like someone who had done something they'd believed was right and was beginning to understand the specific cost of having been wrong. I had known Garrett Aldridge for 13 years, met him when I was 26, married him when I was 28, divorced him when I was 39, and I had never wanted anything bad to happen to him, not even at the worst moments of the divorce, not even in the week I'd spent searching for my daughter. But I also had nothing to say to him in that moment. Joelle Deschamps thanked everyone for their cooperation. Clifton Bray said they'd be in touch about the modification proceedings. Denise said we'd look forward to reviewing any motion he filed. Then Garrett left the room and the door closed, and it was just Lily and me and Tasha standing by the window. The drive back to Asheville took 8 hours and 23 minutes, which is 10 minutes longer than the drive down, because we stopped twice for food that Lily actually ate, which I watched with the specific relief of a parent whose child has been eating someone else's cooking for a week, and who has been worrying, irrationally but persistently, about whether the food was right. She ate a breakfast sandwich at a rest stop outside Cookeville and most of a cheese quesadilla at a place we found off the highway in Cookeville, and I watched her eat both of them and felt something slowly releasing in my chest, some held tension that had been there since the school secretary's careful voice on the phone 6 days earlier. Lily sat in the backseat with Tasha for part of the drive, and they played a game on Tasha's phone and talked about things I mostly couldn't hear, and then she moved to the front seat when Tasha fell asleep, and she and I talked about everything and nothing. Her new school in Nashville that she'd started, and then immediately stopped attending, a book she'd been reading, a girl at her regular school named Priya who she'd been texting and missed, and the fact that Nashville had very good biscuits but not as good as the place in Asheville that she considered the definitive standard. She didn't talk about Garrett much. When she did, she was careful, in the way she'd been careful in the courthouse room. She said he'd told her I knew about the move. She said she hadn't believed him because I would have told her. She said when he took her phone, she decided she needed to find another way. She said Mrs. Whitaker next door was nice and let her use her phone when she asked. She said she figured if she could tell me where she was, I'd come. I asked if she'd been scared. She thought about it. She said she wasn't really scared. She said she knew I'd come. I kept my eyes on the road for a moment before I could trust my voice. Then I said, "You're right. I always come." She nodded like this was obvious and went back to looking out the window. The criminal referral from the Davidson County DA's office moved through the system with the speed that criminal referrals typically don't, which is to say slowly, but with enough eventual momentum to matter. The Davidson County District Attorney's Office, after reviewing the documentation provided by Special Agent Pruitt and the family court record, filed criminal charges against Garrett under Tennessee Code 39-13-306, custodial interference, a Class E felony that carried up to 2 years in prison and a fine of up to $3,000. They also referred the case back to the Buncombe County DA in North Carolina for parallel charges under North Carolina General Statute 14-320.1, which governed the same conduct in the originating state. The potential for charges in 2 states simultaneously was what caused Clifton Bray to call Denise 3 weeks after our return to Asheville and begin discussing a resolution. Garrett, facing the genuine possibility of felony convictions in 2 jurisdictions, elected to enter into a plea arrangement that included a formal guilty plea to the North Carolina misdemeanor version of the charge, a suspended sentence, 2 years of probation with specific monitoring conditions, and a comprehensive modification of the custody agreement that reflected, formally and legally, what had been functionally true throughout our co-parenting arrangement. I was Lily's primary parent, and any modification of that arrangement required legal process, not unilateral action. The custody modification hearing was handled back in Buncombe County before Judge Carolyn Whitfield, who had been with us from the beginning and who received the agreed modification with what I can only describe as quiet satisfaction. The new arrangement gave Garrett regular parenting time on alternating weekends and a portion of school holidays. Not nothing, not the removal of his parental role, but a restructuring that reflected both Lily's expressed preferences, gathered in an interview with a court-appointed guardian ad litem named Rosalind Ferreira, who specialized in representing children's interests in high-conflict custody proceedings, and the factual record of the prior arrangement's actual functioning. The geographic restriction was amended to be explicit in both directions. Neither parent could relocate more than 30 miles from Asheville with Lily without a court order, and the process for requesting such an order was specified in detail that left no room for the kind of interpretation Garrett had apparently made before. He signed the modification consent order in a courtroom on a Thursday morning in October, 6 weeks after Lily came home. I was present. He was present. Lily was not. She was at school, where she belonged, with perfect attendance again after a week's interruption. After the hearing, I sat in the parking lot of the Buncombe County Courthouse for a while before I drove anywhere. It was a clear October morning, the kind of morning Asheville does particularly well, with that specific autumn light that makes everything look like it's been lit from inside. I thought about the week Lily had been gone and the 8-hour drive in the courtroom and the moment she'd walked through the door. I thought about what Portia Greaves at the National Center had said. The parent who takes a child almost always makes contact with someone they trust, and that contact is usually how we find them, and how in our case it hadn't been Garrett's contact with someone he trusted that had found Lily. It was Lily's contact with someone she trusted. Every night, despite everything one way or another, she had found a way to call. She had memorized addresses and borrowed phones and deployed a 9-year-old's version of strategic thinking to make sure I knew where she was. The system had worked. Eventually, the court orders and the federal involvement, and the UCCJEA and all the institutional machinery that grinds slowly but does grind. But what had made it work was Lily's voice on the phone, Lily's specific and determined unwillingness to simply disappear into a situation someone else had created for her. I called Tasha from the parking lot and told her the hearing was done and that everything was signed. She said, "Good. Now come over and eat something. You look like a ghost?" I said I didn't look like anything over the phone. She said she could tell. I drove to her house and ate a full meal for the first time in 6 weeks, and felt the last of the held tension leave my shoulders. It did not leave quietly or all at once. It left in stages over the following weeks and months, in the specific gradual way that the body releases something it's been carrying at emergency capacity. There were nights in those months when I'd lie awake listening for Lily's breathing from the next room, the way I had when she was a baby, just needing to confirm the sound of it. There were days when I'd pick her up from school and feel the specific involuntary relief of seeing her walk out the door as though I'd been holding my breath since morning. These responses faded gradually as they do, replaced by the ordinary textures of life, homework and dinner and the Saturday morning routine we'd had for years, which involved cartoons and too much syrup on the pancakes and Lily explaining the plot of whatever book she was currently reading in more detail than anyone except me would willingly receive. Garrett served his probation without incident. He relocated to Nashville permanently after the modification hearing, which the court had approved given that his parenting time was now structured around travel rather than proximity, and which Lily accepted with the pragmatic clarity of a child who has already processed more than she should have had to and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. She saw him on the schedule, alternating weekends, school breaks, a portion of summer, and she told me once that he'd apologized to her, that he'd said he'd thought he was doing the right thing by moving the 3 of them to Nashville, by trying to build a new life, and that he'd been wrong about how he'd gone about it. She said she told him she understood why he'd done it, but that it wasn't okay that he'd lied to her. She said this to me in the car on the way home from school, looking out the window, and then she changed the subject to something about a project she was working on for her science class. She processed things the way she always had, thoroughly, quietly on her own timeline, arriving at conclusions that were more settled than you'd expect from someone her age. She came by this honestly. I'd been doing it the same way my whole life. Audrey Whitaker, the neighbor who'd let Lily use her phone 5 times in the course of a week, received a very long handwritten letter from me about 3 months after everything was resolved. I thanked her for the kindness she'd extended to a child who'd knocked on her door and asked to make a call. She wrote back on a note card with a small printed bird in the corner and said that she had a granddaughter Lily's age and that she'd have done the same for any child who asked, that she hoped everything had worked out, and that Lily had seemed like a very smart and determined little girl. I kept the note card in the same folder where I keep the court documents. The modification order, the contempt finding, the federal file closure notice from Special Agent Pruitt dated 48 days after he'd opened it. The folder sits in the top drawer of my filing cabinet, which is where I keep things that I want to be able to access immediately if I ever need them. I have not needed them since. I do not expect to need them, but they're there. Lily turned 10 in December, 2 months after everything was fully resolved. And I threw her a birthday party with 12 of her friends from school, including Priya, who she had been texting all week about the party's cake flavor. We had chocolate with raspberry filling, which was Lily's specific and non-negotiable requirement, and which the bakery I ordered it from produced with the kind of precision that made Lily walk around it twice when it arrived before pronouncing it acceptable. It was a loud and chaotic and wonderful afternoon full of 10-year-old girls in various states of enthusiasm about the games we'd set up, and at some point near the end of it I looked across the room at my daughter, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 3 of her friends, showing them something on her phone, laughing at something with that specific full-bodied laugh she has that starts in her stomach and takes over her whole face. Oh, and I thought about the school secretary's careful voice and the empty house on Meridian Street, and the 8-hour drive and the courthouse room and the cat patch backpack. I thought about all of it the way you think about something that happened to a previous version of yourself, not without feeling, but with the specific quality of distance that comes when things are genuinely over. I thought about Lily finding Audrey Whitaker's door and knocking on it. I thought about her voice on the phone every night, one way or another. She had known I'd come. She had been right. She'd made sure I could. That's the thing nobody tells you about these situations, the thing that you learn only by living through one. The formal systems matter, and thank whatever force organizes the universe that they exist. That there are federal agents and family court judges, and UCCJEA protocols and guardians ad litem who do their jobs with care and competence and the kind of sustained attention that complicated situations require. All of that matters. None of it would have been enough without my 9-year-old daughter memorizing an address on Elliston Place and borrowing a stranger's phone and calling me every single night until I came. She was the system that didn't fail. She was the contact that found her. She knew I'd come, and so she made herself findable, and so I came, and there is not a single other version of this story that I would accept. Rosalind Ferreira, The guardian ad litem who had interviewed Lily for the custody modification proceeding sent me a note after the case closed. She said that in 17 years of representing children in custody proceedings, she had rarely encountered a child as articulate and self-possessed as Lily in describing her own situation and her own needs. She said Lily had told her, during their interview, that she hadn't been scared when her father moved her to Nashville because she knew her mother would figure it out, and that she had decided the most helpful thing she could do was make sure her mother had the information she needed. Rosalind said she'd found this remarkable. I found it, if I'm being honest, entirely unsurprising. Lily has always been that way. Deliberate, methodical, self-possessed in situations that would flatten most adults. She got it from somewhere. I like to think she got it from both of us, from the parts of Garrett and me that were worth keeping. Assembled into someone who is, at 10 years old, and going on 100, already more together than either of us managed to be on our best days. She will be fine. She's already fine. She was fine, even in the middle of it all, in ways that I'm still catching up to. 6 months after the resolution, I reorganized my filing cabinet and found myself holding the folder of court documents for a moment before I put it back. The contempt order, the federal file closure, the modification consent, the note cards from Audrey Whitaker, the call log from Lily's borrowed phone calls, which I'd printed out and included because Denise had said to document everything, and I had learned to listen to Denise. 5 calls over 6 days. The timestamps. The Nashville area code. The address on Elliston Place. Still written in my handwriting on the Post-it note I'd stuck to the inside of the folder because I hadn't wanted to lose it. I held the folder. Then I put it back in the drawer. Then I went to make dinner, because Lily was coming home from school in 40 minutes and she told me that morning she wanted pasta, the specific kind with the sauce I make from scratch that takes longer than the jarred version, but that she has insisted upon since she was 6 years old. I made the sauce from scratch. She came home and ate 2 bowls and told me in elaborate detail about a disagreement at recess that had been resolved satisfactorily, in her assessment, for all parties. She did her homework at the kitchen table while I cleaned up. At 8:15 she went to bed. At 8:22 from the next room she called out, "Good night, Mom." I said good night. The apartment was quiet. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.